Hey guys, tonight, let's settle into our little time machine. Dim the lights, curl up under your blanket, and, if you want, grab a warm cup of something comforting, tea, cocoa, maybe lukewarm water, because why not? We're about to float gently back to the jungles of Mesoamerica, to a civilization that sounds exotic and mysterious. But, spoiler alert, life there could be, well, kind of awful. I'm talking about the Maya. And yes, I mean the ancient Maya, long before anyone invented Instagram or cat videos. Now, when most people think of the Maya, they probably picture impressive stone pyramids, elaborate calendar systems, and a knack for architecture that would make your interior designer feel inadequate. But behind the big temples and fancy stele, daily life was less Instagram-worthy. Imagine living in a place where your neighbors might casually sacrifice themselves to the gods. Your ruler had mood swings that could rival a toddler's, and your diet mostly consisted of maize, which, honestly, is fine until you realize maize is not exactly nutritionally complete. Let's float gently into the first layer of Mayan misery: childhood. If you think medieval European peasants had it rough, brace yourself. Mayan children were, by all accounts, adorable little mini-humans, but also fragile. The infant mortality rate was, let's say, shockingly high. A lot of kids didn't make it past 5, which is a number that really changes how you approach birthday parties. It wasn't because the Maya were negligent. Of course, they were meticulous farmers, clever astronomers, an extremely ritualistic people, but disease, malnutrition, and accidents lurked behind every thatched roof. If a child survived early childhood, they had a decent chance of making it into adolescence. But decent in this case might still involve frequent illness or painful bone growth issues due to dietary deficiencies. The Maya were obsessed with maize. Maize was life. Maize was money. Maize was basically their version of oxygen. And I say this because their entire nutrition system leaned heavily on it. Sounds fine, right? Except that relying so much on one crop comes with a small, little problem. Pellagra. Pellagra is caused by a lack of niacin in the diet and leads to dermatitis, diarrhea, and dementia. So, imagine a kid growing up, mostly eating maize porridge, looking at the sky, marveling at the planets, and slowly developing a condition that basically turns your skin into a mildly irritated sandpaper. Charming. Moving on from diet, let's talk education. I put education in quotes because, while the Maya had a complex writing system, learning to read it was not exactly a bedtime story. Only elite children, meaning sons and daughters of nobles, were instructed in reading glyphs, performing religious rituals, or reciting long, complicated genealogies that would put any modern history test to shame everyone else. Well, they learned practical skills: farming, weaving, building, and generally keeping the civilization running, while hoping not to die young. It's sort of like the difference between being taught to code and being taught to carry bricks up a pyramid, but both were culturally valued, I suppose. And speaking of pyramids, let's talk about labor. The Maya were incredible builders. Those massive stone temples that dot the jungle were assembled without wheels or iron tools, which, if you stop and think about it, is equal parts awe-inspiring and slightly terrifying. Someone had to cut all that limestone, drag it hundreds of meters, and carefully stack it in perfect alignment all under the tropical sun, which, by the way, is not a forgiving co-worker. This work wasn't exactly voluntary. It was often demanded by rulers or local elites. So, picture this. You've survived childhood, you've avoided pellagra, and now you're under the blistering heat, hauling massive rocks while chanting something in a language you've barely mastered. Again, awe-inspiring for future archaeologists, kind of miserable for you. Religion also played a starring role in the stress of daily life. The Maya were deeply spiritual, with a pantheon of gods that demanded attention, gifts, and sometimes human blood. Ritual sacrifice was a part of state ceremonies, and while it wasn't a daily occurrence for most, it was a looming reality. If you were a noble or a captive, your life might be offered to the gods during important calendrical events. For the average citizen, ritual obligations meant work, preparing temples, making offerings, fasting, or performing dances designed to please deities you hoped wouldn't smite you with drought or disease. I like to think of it as very spiritual project management with slightly higher stakes. Let's drift now into the more personal side of life. Healthcare. The Maya had herbal remedies, skilled midwives, and shamans who were both spiritual and medicinal practitioners. But despite all that, they were dealing with a pre-antibiotic world. An infected cut could turn deadly. Malaria, parasites, and other tropical diseases claimed lives quietly, without much fanfare. Imagine trying to manage your life's ambitions, like building a palace or mastering astronomy, while secretly worrying that the next fever could be fatal. It's a low-level anxiety you can't just Google away. And, because this is history, we have to talk warfare, although I promise to keep it gentle and not sensational. The Maya were city-state rulers, and yes, city-states sometimes fought each other. When that happened, the outcomes were unpleasant for captives, who could be enslaved or sacrificed. For regular citizens, war meant forced labor to support armies, constructing fortifications, providing supplies, or even being conscripted into fighting. So, beyond all the already present daily pressures, there was the occasional specter of intercity conflict hanging overhead, reminding everyone that life was unpredictable. Let's drift next into the elite experience, which, ironically, was also brutal in its own way. Maya rulers were glorified humans with enormous privileges, sure, but privileges came with pressure. Every ruler had to maintain legitimacy, interpret celestial signs correctly, and oversee monumental projects that could bankrupt a city-state if mismanaged. Plus, nobles were constantly performing rituals that could be personally painful, like bloodletting. Bloodletting, for the uninitiated, is exactly what it sounds like. A noble would pierce or cut parts of their own body to offer blood to the gods. It was symbolic, it was spiritual, and it was, from a modern perspective, slightly terrifying. So, being rich and powerful didn't make life less brutal, it just made the brutality more ceremonial. Another aspect worth floating over is climate and environment. The Maya lived in tropical forests that were beautiful but hostile. Swamps, mosquitoes, jaguars, not exactly the amenities of a modern hotel. Agricultural productivity depended heavily on rainfall patterns, and droughts could lead to famine. And here's the kicker. Without modern irrigation techniques, a bad season could be catastrophic, especially in the lowlands. Crops failed, food became scarce, and suddenly, that maize porridge you thought was boringly abundant turned into a luxury. We should also consider mental health, though obviously we're speculating a bit. The pressure of survival, ritual, social expectations, and climate unpredictability likely weighed heavily on everyone, from commoners to kings. Imagine the anxiety of a ruler reading the stars, trying to interpret omens, knowing that your people could revolt, or that a drought could ruin your city, or the psychological stress of a commoner, praying that your family survives another year of disease and crop failures. It wasn't a happy place all the time. But then again, when has human history been happy in the way we imagine today? All right, now let's float gently to the end of the day in the life section. After a long, exhausting day of farming, hauling limestone, attending ritual ceremonies, or performing the occasional ceremonial self-piercing, Maya citizens returned to their homes. The commoners lived in thatched huts, small and sparse, with little protection against insects or rain. Privacy was a rare commodity. The elite lived in larger structures with more decoration, but even then, privacy was still relative, and life was structured around duty and observation rather than comfort. Sleep was a necessary reprieve, and I like to imagine that, lying down after a long day, they looked up at the stars and thought about the same things we do. Survival, family, maybe wondering what the next day would bring. So, to sum up this gentle float through Mayan life without making it sound to cheerful existence was a mixture of beauty, complexity, and relentless challenge. The society produced incredible architecture, astronomy, art, and written records, all while people navigated diets that could kill, diseases that did kill, environmental hazards, political stress, and social expectations. In short, life was beautifully brutal, and that S where we leave part 1 for now, basking in the irony that the civilization which gave us towering pyramids and intricate calendars was also a place where life was, quite literally, an endurance sport. Float gently with that thought. Close your eyes. Let the rhythmic patterns of the jungle, the slow swaying of ancient temples, and the quiet whisper of the past lull you toward the next chapter, where we'll explore more of the human drama that played out under those tropical skies. All right, welcome back, gentle night traveler. If you're still curled up with a warm drink or just letting your eyelids droop, perfect. Tonight we float a little deeper into the jungle, where stone pyramids rise like silent guardians and rulers carry burdens heavier than their ceremonial headdresses. Life for Maya royalty, as we mentioned last time, wasn't all ornate jewelry and fancy feasts. In fact, it could be surprisingly miserable. Let's begin with one of the more famous city-states, Palenque. Here, rulers were not just kings, they were intermediaries between the gods and the people. Their job descriptions included interpreting omens, leading armies, managing labor, overseeing temple construction, and performing very specific and sometimes painful rituals. One famous ruler, Pacal the Great, reigned for 68 years. Yes, 68 years. That's a long time to maintain perfect posture, interpret the heavens correctly, and manage a bureaucracy without modern conveniences. And while he's often remembered for the elaborate tomb built for him, which looks like a mini-universe carved into stone, we shouldn't forget that Pacal probably had insomnia from worrying about crop yields, rebellions, and whether the gods were truly impressed with his self-sacrifice rituals. Speaking of self-sacrifice, let's gently float over to bloodletting. This wasn't optional for rulers, it was expected. Pacal and his contemporaries would pierce tongues, earlobes, or genitals and collect their own blood for ritual purposes. Think of it as a spiritual wellness routine with slightly higher stakes than a yoga class. There's a famous scene carved in stone where Pacal is depicted performing this ritual, calmly seated, while attendants watch dutifully. It's almost serene, in a very medieval, I hope I don't faint kind of way. Now, if you're imagining that only kings suffered, let's slowly zoom in on queens. Maya queens were essential for dynastic stability. They were often married off as teenagers to much older kings, expected to produce heirs quickly, and participate in the same elaborate rituals, including bloodletting. One queen might have a particularly rough day, like performing a ceremonial bloodletting in front of hundreds of spectators, while simultaneously worrying about her children surviving childhood, her husband not getting killed in battle, and the crops not failing. Basically, a multitasking nightmare that would make modern executives cry into their office coffee. Speaking of children, dynastic pressure often meant child mortality wasn't just a statistic, it was personal, public, and politically relevant. If a royal child died, it wasn't just a family tragedy. It could destabilize alliances, provoke mourning rituals across the city-state, and even invite opportunistic neighbors to take advantage of the perceived weakness. Imagine being a grieving parent but needing to appear perfectly composed for political reasons while possibly still bleeding a little from ceremonial cuts. Gentle, relaxing times, indeed. Now, let's float over to Copan, another city-state that offers a peek into the quietly tragic lives of rulers. Copanese kings loved recording their reigns in hieroglyphic stairways, which is fascinating for us, but probably exhausting for them. These inscriptions were not casual diary entries. They meticulously chronicled every ritual, war, and celestial observation. King Waxicladjun, Yuba Keowil, for example, had an obsession with astronomical alignment, which is to say he spent years ensuring that temples and pyramids matched celestial events. This was meticulous, painstaking work that required constant supervision of laborers and astronomers. Imagine the anxiety of accidentally misaligning a temple by a few centimeters and offending the gods. Some historians gently suggest that the stress might have shortened his lifespan, but we'll never know for sure. And it wasn't just rulers. Nobles also had lives laced with pressure. They were expected to participate in complex rituals, supervise labor, marry strategically, and sometimes fight in wars. There's evidence suggesting that noble children, like their commoner peers, could be enrolled in ritual training at surprisingly young ages. Think of a 7-year-old learning ceremonial chants, memorizing calendars, and practicing self-sacrifice rituals, all while trying not to get sunstroke. Let's drift into religious specialists, or shamans. They weren't rulers, but their lives were still delicate. Shamans held significant authority, performing healing rituals, divining the future, and interpreting omens. But that came with the weight of responsibility. A misread omen could mean famine, war, or disease striking the city. Imagine being tasked with predicting the future using cacao beans, animal entrails, or abstract astronomical calculations, knowing that an incorrect reading could cost lives. The pressure was subtle, constant, and frankly, exhausting. Now, let's float gently into ritual calendars, which governed everything. The Maya had multiple calendars, one for the sun, one for ceremonial cycles, one for longer cosmological cycles. Keeping these aligned was not just academic, it was existential. Rulers had to plan ceremonies based on these cycles, and missing a single date could provoke divine displeasure. That means the kings and their advisors were living in a perpetual state of low-level panic, scanning the skies and consulting stars, just to make sure everything stayed on schedule for the gods. Modern anxiety apps have nothing on this. Oh, and don't forget feasting and fasting rituals. Royalty might spend days fasting in preparation for a ritual, which is basically starvation with a fancy name. Then they'd switch to feasting, consuming food in ways designed to honor the gods and display wealth. These were highly structured events, requiring constant attention, participation, and observation. Anyone failing in performance risked public embarrassment, spiritual consequences, or both. Imagine having your calorie intake dictated by the stars. We can't skip over marital alliances, which were tricky. Royal marriages were rarely about love. They were political tools designed to secure alliances, prevent wars, or consolidate power. Queens might be relocated across regions, sometimes traveling long distances in hot, humid jungles while heavily veiled and guarded. Communication was slow, isolation was frequent, and loneliness was common. If a marriage failed to produce heirs or produced heirs who were sickly or died young, the consequences could ripple across generations. That subtle, long-term stress layered on top of an already taxing existence. And, because we're floating lazily through misery, let's note dietary quirks among the elite. While commoners survived mostly on maize, beans, and squash, elites had more variety, including cacao, turkey, and occasional game meat. Yet, they still faced malnutrition, dental disease, and periodic food shortages, especially during poor harvests. Fancy feasts didn't mean nutritious feasts. The pressure to display wealth sometimes outweighed basic health concerns. A noble could be surrounded by luxury, yet suffer from the same dietary deficiencies as a commoner. Now, let's drift gently to aging and mortality. Life expectancy was low by modern standards, even for elites. Kings and nobles often died in their 40s or 50s, which is not exactly a long career span if you're busy building pyramids, leading armies, and performing daily rituals. Age brought new anxieties, ensuring heirs were competent, passing on religious knowledge, and maintaining political alliances. And of course, there was always the possibility of illness or assassination. So relaxation was more of a theoretical concept than a practical one. Finally, let's drift toward a slightly lighter note, if only to lull ourselves closer to sleep. Despite all these pressures, bloodletting, ritual obligations, child mortality, famine, and political stress, the Maya were resilient, creative, and extraordinarily organized. Their pain and challenges didn't stop them from producing magnificent art, writing complex texts, and creating an intricate understanding of astronomy. So while life was brutal, it was also strangely, beautifully human. The combination of suffering, ingenuity, and ritual created a civilization that endures in our imagination, even as we gently close our eyes and float toward dreams. So as we end part 2, imagine the quiet jungle nights, the pyramids silhouetted against the stars, and the rulers and nobles alike lying down. After another exhausting day of ceremonial obligations, astronomical observations, and the eternal human balancing act of survival and prestige, let your mind drift over those temples and the soft whispers of history. Sleepy yet mildly intrigued, you now ready to move further into the personal tragedies and quirks of Mayan elites in the next part. Welcome back, night traveler. If you're still tucked in, maybe with a blanket over your shoulders and your eyelids growing heavy, perfect. Tonight we drift a little closer into the intimate lives of Maya rulers and nobles, the part of history textbooks that rarely tells you about sleepless nights, awkward marriages, and ceremonial pain. We're floating past pyramids and into the bedrooms, temples, and private chambers of ancient Maya royalty. Let's start with child kings, because why not begin with someone who had literally no idea what they were signing up for? In Maya society, it was common for a young child to inherit the throne after the death of a parent. That could mean being crowned at 7, 8, or 10, and immediately being expected to perform complex rituals, consult astrologers, and manage advisors, some of whom were older and more politically savvy than the child. Imagine being 7 and told you're in charge of a city-state. Your decisions could anger the gods, and if you misstep, rebels might take over. And yes, this is exactly as terrifying as it sounds. Sleep, rarely. Stress-induced headaches, probably constant. One famous example comes from Dos Pilas, where a child king, crowned as an heir, was surrounded by advisors who were equal parts protective and manipulative. These children grew up under intense surveillance, expected to memorize ritual texts, lead ceremonies, and occasionally bleed on command for the gods. Bloodletting was not optional, and children, unlike adults, were particularly fragile. So you had a tiny human, basically a royal performance artist, balancing mortal risk, divine appeasement, and political maneuvering, all before reaching puberty. Gentle and relaxing imagery, I know. Let's drift over to marriage alliances, which were often awkward, forced, and strategically cruel. Maya queens were frequently married off to much older rulers to cement political ties. For example, a 12-year-old girl might be sent to a distant city-state to marry a 30-year-old king. She'd be expected to produce heirs quickly, participate in public rituals, and adapt to entirely new environments. Loneliness, cultural dislocation, and pressure to perform were probably constant companions. And yet, she had to maintain grace and composure, smiling politely while occasionally cutting herself for ceremonial purposes. That's multitasking taken to a level that modern productivity apps could never measure. Now, let's gently float toward dynastic rivalries. Maya elites were constantly negotiating family politics. Rival siblings, distant cousins, or ambitious in-laws could all pose threats to a ruler's authority. Imagine a king in his 20s discovering that a cousin, once considered an ally, might be plotting to take his throne. Stressful, absolutely. Tragic, often, and complicated by the fact that these political rivalries were rarely private. Advisors, priests, and city officials all watched every move. Your private thoughts were, by necessity, public property. Let's pause for a moment on dietary quirks among royalty, which were sometimes as punishing as they were indulgent. Royal feasts included cacao, turkey, squash, and occasionally exotic game meat. Yet these meals were often ceremonial, consumed in ways dictated by ritual rather than taste or nutrition. Some rulers engaged in fasting before important ceremonies, meaning that, within a single day, they might oscillate between near starvation and extravagant feasting. Not exactly restful for digestion or mental health. And then there were dietary hazards. Spoiled maize, undercooked meat, or contaminated water could make anyone, noble or commoner, seriously ill. Now, let's drift gently toward personal tragedies, which the Maya had in abundance. Child mortality wasn't just a number. For nobles, it could destroy dynastic plans. A king might lose multiple children before they reached maturity. Each loss wasn't just emotionally devastating, it had political repercussions. Marriages had to be renegotiated, alliances reconsidered, and succession plans rewritten. Imagine the grief compounded by duty, performed publicly, and the expectation to remain a calm, God-pleasing figure, sleepy yet tragically human. We should also float over ritual anxiety. Some rulers were obsessed with aligning their cities and ceremonies with celestial events. A miscalculation could be interpreted as offending the gods, potentially triggering famine or disease. Kings often consulted astrologers, shamans, and scribes constantly, tracking everything from eclipses to planetary positions. Imagine lying awake at night, worried that a slightly misaligned pyramid could anger a god and doom your city. Gentle insomnia in its purest historical form. And then there were weird personal habits among some rulers. Some elites were rumored to be perfectionists about appearance, ceremonial attire, and even posture. Long periods of sitting in uncomfortable positions during rituals. Repeated self-bloodletting and elaborate clothing probably led to chronic aches, back pain, and occasional fainting. So, yes, The image of rulers as glamorous or invincible is slightly misleading. They were basically high-status humans with painfully complex jobs, prone to all the bodily complaints we quietly suffer from today. Let's drift toward long-distance dynastic stress. Marriages and alliances often required rulers to coordinate across city-states, sending messages via runners or observing ritual calendars simultaneously in multiple locations. A misinterpreted message could be disastrous. You might imagine a ruler sweating in ceremonial robes, squinting at a stela, thinking, did they get the glyphs right? Or did they accidentally curse me? Modern email anxiety has nothing on this. Then there's the hidden melancholy. Maya rulers sometimes buried themselves in work or ritual to cope with personal loss, political pressure, or social expectations. Temples, pyramids, and elaborate stelae often served as both religious devotion and personal legacy building, a kind of historical therapy for dealing with stress. And yet, the monuments themselves, beautiful as they were, also stood as reminders of the weight these humans carried. A pyramid might be admired by future generations, but for the builders and planners, it was a monument to relentless obligation. And finally, let's gently float over aging and succession anxiety. Kings and queens rarely grew old in peace. Even in later years, they had to maintain physical stamina for rituals, mental acuity for governance, and spiritual purity to avoid divine wrath. The looming specter of death added pressure. Succession disputes, potential coups, and dynastic crises were constant concerns. Sleep, when it happened, was probably brief and punctuated by ritual dreams, anxiety over heirs, or the rhythmic sounds of the jungle outside. So, as we close part 3, picture it, the jungles of Mesoamerica, the silent stone temples, and the quietly stressed rulers performing their daily dances with mortality, duty, and divine expectation. Life was complex, often painful, but also deeply human. The Maya, in their meticulous ceremonies, dynastic dramas, and personal quirks, created a civilization that endures not because it was easy, but because it was lived with relentless, beautiful effort. As your eyelids drift heavier and heavier, let your mind wander over pyramids, ceremonial plazas, and the soft, green expanse of ancient jungles. Remember that these humans, despite suffering, built something extraordinary. And in that thought, gently float closer to sleep, carrying with you the soft, lulling weight of history's quiet tragedies. Let's begin with rituals, because the Maya had a lot of them. Almost everything was ritualized: planting, harvesting, marriage, birth, death, even the changing of the seasons. For the average citizen, participation often involved preparing offerings of maize, chocolate, or small crafts. This sounds relaxing until you remember that failing to do it correctly might invite the gods' displeasure, or so people believed. So, imagine waking up each morning, thinking, okay, today I need to make the gods happy, or possibly die from famine or disease. It's the ancient equivalent of checking your emails, anxiously but with higher stakes and more ceremonial incense. For commoners, rituals were more about participation than spectacle. They had to contribute labor, prepare ceremonial foods, or attend public observances. But these rituals also created a rhythm to life, a predictable framework amidst the uncertainty of crops, disease, and the occasional war. There's a certain comfort in predictability, even if the gods are involved, because at least the chaos has structure. Let's float gently toward festivals, which were essentially ritual celebrations with a social twist. Maya festivals could mark the solstices, equinoxes, or specific calendrical events. People might dance, play music, or perform dramatic reenactments of myths. These festivals sound delightful and, in a way, they were also exhausting. Preparing food, decorating ceremonial spaces, crafting costumes, and rehearsing dances was labor-intensive. And for rulers, festivals involved long hours of participation, ceremonial bloodletting, and meticulous performance. Imagine a week-long citywide celebration where everyone is watching your every move, and your failure to act piously could result in social or spiritual embarrassment. Not exactly a spa day. Next, we float to agricultural rhythms, which dominated daily life for most Maya. Farming was central to survival, and most people spent hours in fields, tending maize, beans, and squash. The cycles of planting and harvesting dictated the calendar. Rainy season meant long hours in the fields, hot sun and muddy soils. Dry season meant carefully rationing water and food, hoping the crops had survived the previous months. While elites had more luxurious lives, they still depended entirely on these rhythms. Pyramids and stelae don't grow themselves. After all, food itself was deeply ritualized. Maize, as we discussed earlier, was sacred. Commoners made tortillas, tamales, and porridge, while elites might enjoy more variety, cacao drinks, turkey, squash, and even fish from rivers. Yet all food was prepared with a sense of spiritual care. Some rituals dictated which foods were consumed when and who could eat them. Even a simple meal could feel like a ceremonial act, which adds a subtle weight to something we today consider mundane. Let's gently drift toward clothing and adornment, another daily rhythm of life. Maya people, especially the elite, spent considerable effort on clothing and personal appearance. Nobles wore elaborate textiles dyed with natural pigments, jewelry of jade and shell, and ceremonial headdresses that could be quite heavy. It wasn't vanity, it was social expectation. The commoners had simpler attire, but even they participated in ritual adornment for festivals and ceremonies. Imagine tying on an intricate headdress for a dawn ceremony while trying not to faint from heat and hunger. Fashion as ritual, stressfully beautiful. Now, we should float over to recreation, which was a gentle counterpoint to work and ritual. The Maya had ball games, which were part sport, part ritual, and sometimes part political statement. For commoners, the ball game was an entertaining break from work. For elites, it could be a serious, high-stakes performance watched by the city. Picture sweaty nobles running around a ball court under the sun while simultaneously performing ritual gestures. Fun, yes, but exhausting and fraught with social pressure. Next, let's gently explore market life, which offered rhythm and social connection. People traded goods like cacao, textiles, tools, and food. Markets were places for both survival and gossip, a gentle hum of human interaction in the city. Even here, the Maya maintained social hierarchy. Nobles and merchants had privileges, while commoners negotiated carefully to avoid offending wealthier or more powerful buyers. The market was a tiny theater of daily negotiation, commerce, and social subtlety, a low-key stage where everyone had a role. And we can't skip healing and illness rituals. While herbal medicine and shamans were central, treatment often had ritual elements. If a child was sick, offerings were made, incantations recited, and ceremonies performed alongside medical treatment. Illness wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, and the rituals reinforced a sense of control over an unpredictable world. Imagine a mother pacing, chanting, and offering cacao, praying the gods intervene while also feeding her child maize porridge, gentle worry as part of daily life. Let's drift toward construction rhythms, because even building temples and pyramids had a pulse. Laborers, craftsmen, and artisans followed seasonal cycles. Some tasks could only be done in dry months, some in rainy. Elites coordinated projects, supervised work, and performed ceremonial oversight. This slow, steady rhythm of construction, stone by stone, day by day, mirrored the rhythm of the society itself. It was repetitive, exhausting, and strangely meditative, if you squint. And speaking of rain, climate challenges were a constant presence. Archaeologists have found evidence of prolonged droughts affecting multiple city-states. Even short periods without sufficient rain could reduce crop yields dramatically. The lowland Maya had limited water storage infrastructure, so a dry season was stressful for everyone, from farmers desperately watering fields to elites orchestrating ceremonial rituals meant to appease rain gods. Life in a tropical paradise had its ironic drawbacks: humid air, sweltering sun, and a looming fear that the sky might simply not cooperate. Next, let's drift toward intercity competition and warfare. Maya city-states were rarely united under a single ruler. Each city-state had its king, its army, its elite, and often its ambitions. Alliances shifted frequently, sometimes with marriages, sometimes with conflicts. Warfare wasn't constant, but when it happened, it disrupted daily life. Fields could be abandoned, labor diverted to fortifications, and captives taken or executed. For ordinary citizens, this meant uncertainty. For elites, it meant maintaining political networks, strategizing, and occasionally performing bloodletting rituals to ensure divine favor before a campaign. Imagine trying to enjoy a ceremonial banquet while half your city is preparing for a potential attack. Not exactly relaxing. Now, let's float over to economic stress. Maya cities depended on trade networks for resources they couldn't produce locally, like obsidian, jade, and exotic foods. Disruptions, whether from drought, warfare, or political tension, could destabilize trade. Nobles and merchants had to constantly negotiate, maintain trust, and avoid offending allies. This created a subtle but persistent anxiety. Failure in the marketplace wasn't just financial, it could erode social and political standing. Picture a wealthy merchant sipping cacao while secretly worrying that a rival city might withhold crucial obsidian. Gentle paranoia, perfectly normal. Let's drift to ritual obligations under stress. When cities faced famine, disease, or conflict, rulers and priests often doubled down on ceremonies, thinking that pleasing the gods could avert disaster. That meant more bloodletting, more processions, and more offerings. While it might seem spiritually uplifting, the reality was exhausting. Nobles and commoners alike had to participate, and the elite were always under pressure to perform correctly. The gods were patient, but not infinite in tolerance, or so they believed. Environmental degradation also played a role in the gradual decline. Deforestation, soil exhaustion, and erosion affected farming productivity. As more land was cleared to feed growing populations, the ecosystem struggled to keep up. It's a slow, creeping stress on daily life: smaller harvests, harder labor, and subtle malnutrition. For the elites, this added pressure to maintain city stability and appease restless gods. Even a perfectly aligned pyramid couldn't guarantee rainfall. Now, let's gently drift to social stress and population fatigue. Living under constant ritual obligations, environmental pressures, and political uncertainty meant that daily life could be monotonous and taxing. Children grew up quickly, learning ceremonies and survival skills early. Adults worked long hours in fields, temples, and workshops. Nobles oversaw construction, observed celestial events, and ensured adherence to social hierarchies. Everyone was part of a delicate rhythm that required constant attention. The jungle might seem idyllic, but the pressures of survival were ever present. Another subtle factor was succession anxiety. As rulers aged or died unexpectedly, disputes over heirs could destabilize entire city-states. Nobles, priests, and commoners watched carefully as families maneuvered for power. Even small cities could descend into political tension that affected trade, ritual, and security. Imagine lying awake at night, listening to the jungle, wondering if your city's heir will act wisely or badly. Gentle insomnia, now with political flair. And then there were psychological burdens of long-term survival. Anthropologists suggest that living in constant tension between ritual obligations, environmental unpredictability, and social hierarchy likely took a mental toll. Anxiety, depression, or fatigue might not have been documented in words, but we can imagine subtle traces in the decisions, art, and ritual practices of the time. The human mind, even in the tropical lowlands, is remarkably sensitive to sustained stress. Despite these pressures, Maya society persisted for centuries, producing magnificent art, architecture, and knowledge. But the slow, cumulative effect of drought, political instability, and environmental degradation eventually contributed to the collapse of many southern lowland cities around 900 CE. Collapse here doesn't mean everyone vanished. It was a gradual decline, a gentle fading of monumental construction, urban density, and political centralization. Life became less ceremonious, cities shrank, and social hierarchies shifted. The jungle slowly reclaimed abandoned plazas and pyramids. And yet, the Maya didn't disappear. Northern cities like Chichén Itzá and Mayopan continued to thrive for centuries afterward, carrying forward cultural, religious, and architectural traditions. People adapted, communities persisted, and human ingenuity endured. Even in decline, the Maya story is one of resilience, quiet, unglamorous, and profoundly human. Welcome back, gentle night traveler. If your eyes are already heavy and your body is sinking further into the mattress, perfect. Tonight we leave the grandeur of pyramids, kings, and queens behind for a slower, softer perspective of the lives of everyday Maya, whose quiet efforts and routines kept the entire civilization humming. For most Maya, life was structured by daily and seasonal rhythms. The sun dictated work and rest. Dawn often began with simple routines, tending small plots of maize, gathering water, and preparing food. The fields were alive with insects, birds, and the occasional jaguar lurking at a distance. Daily survival required attention to detail, because a poorly tended crop or a forgotten ritual could have consequences for the household. Not catastrophic every day, but noticeable enough to keep everyone on their toes. Children, much like we discussed before, were early contributors. They learned skills by imitation, planting seeds, weaving mats, or carrying small loads. Play and learning blended seamlessly, though it was less about leisure and more about preparation. A child tossing a ball might also be memorizing a short glyph or observing ritual motions. Imagine a child simultaneously mastering survival and ceremony. It's exhausting, even in thought. Food preparation was both mundane and ritualized. Commoners consumed maize, beans, squash, chili, and occasionally fish or small game. Meals were simple, but sometimes the act of preparing and serving food had a ceremonial layer, offering the first portion of food to the gods, or blessing the meal with a short incantation, added subtle pressure to what might otherwise be a quiet morning. Even mundane tasks carried the hum of spirituality. Let's drift toward housing. Most Maya families lived in thatched huts with walls of wattle and daub. The interiors were simple: a central hearth, storage spaces, and mats for sleeping. Privacy was minimal. Families shared space, meals, and work. Life was communal, which was comforting in some ways, but exhausting in others. Noise, smells, and the constant demands of work and ritual meant that personal space was a luxury, reserved mostly for the elite. Now, about craftsmanship, artisans were essential for producing pottery, textiles, tools, and ritual objects. Skilled work required attention, patience, and constant observation from supervisors or patrons. Mistakes weren't just aesthetic, they could have social or ritual implications. Imagine weaving a ceremonial mat incorrectly and quietly panicking that someone more powerful might notice. Art and craft were everyday performances, subtle but important. Let's gently float to markets and trade. Commoners often visited markets to barter surplus food, pottery, or craftwork. Markets weren't chaotic spectacles, but slow, rhythmic exchanges. Neighbors, negotiating prices, exchanging news, or gossiping. Even here, subtle social hierarchies persisted. Merchants might slightly intimidate buyers with reputation or charm. Every interaction carried minor tension, but also social connection, which offered relief from fieldwork and ritual obligations. We should also explore healthcare at the household level. Families relied on herbal remedies, shamans, and midwives for routine illnesses, injuries, and childbirth. Women played central roles in healing, using knowledge passed down through generations. This was a gentle, low-intensity form of ritual management, healing as a family duty, intimately tied to daily life. It required care, observation, and occasional anxiety over outcomes. Now, let's drift toward community rituals. Even commoners participated in seasonal festivals, communal dances, and ceremonial processions. They might fast, chant, or decorate plazas with maize, flowers, or colored pigments. Participation was expected but also created social cohesion. You could think of it as a soothing group exercise with subtle social pressure being involved, kept you connected. But failure to participate could invite gossip or divine displeasure. Daily work, of course, included agriculture. Maize cultivation was central, but beans, squash, and other crops supplemented diets. The land required constant attention, clearing weeds, watering, rotating crops, and sometimes negotiating minor disputes with neighbors over resources. Life was repetitive, but the rhythm itself offered a kind of meditation. Every day repeated familiar patterns, punctuated by the occasional festival, ritual, or seasonal event. Finally, let's float gently to nighttime routines. As the sun set, families gathered around hearths. Stories might be told, minor rituals performed, and the day's work reviewed. Children drifted to sleep on mats, elders reflected on the day, and the sounds of the jungle crickets, frogs, and distant jaguars filled the night air. Sleep was precious, necessary, and often the only reprieve from the persistent rhythm of work, ritual, and survival. So, as we close part 6, imagine the quiet Maya household under the starlit sky. Small but vibrant, simple but full of human attention and care. Life was far from easy, but there was structure, ritual, and gentle continuity. And in that soft, rhythmic persistence, the Maya left traces of a civilization both extraordinary and profoundly human. Let's start with personal tragedies, because, as we've seen, life was rarely gentle. Children frequently succumbed to illness or malnutrition. Nobles lost heirs who were crucial for dynastic stability. Rulers experienced the subtle stress of political intrigue, the quiet anxiety of environmental uncertainty, and the ritual pressure of appeasing gods at every step. For ordinary citizens, a single failed harvest could ripple through the household for months. Imagine being a mother, father, or elder, quietly mourning the loss of a child while simultaneously preparing maize offerings to ensure the survival of the rest. Small griefs compounded into a society-wide sense of precariousness. Yet, within these tragedies, there were moments of quiet perseverance. Families adapted to changing circumstances. Rulers sought guidance from shamans and astrologers. Communities celebrated seasonal festivals, marking transitions in the year with ritualized continuity. These small, deliberate acts, planting crops, weaving textiles, observing celestial cycles, were methods of coping, of asserting stability in a world that was often unpredictable. Now, let's float gently toward personal quirks and stories of rulers and elites. Because history isn't just about collapse and survival, it's about people. Some rulers were obsessive about astrology, ensuring that temples, palaces, and ceremonial events were perfectly aligned with celestial movements. Others had peculiar habits, fasting at odd hours, performing private bloodletting in secret, or meticulously tracking every minor ritual with a level of detail that would make modern productivity enthusiasts weep. For the average observer, these quirks were sometimes baffling, sometimes amusing, but always deeply human. Take child rulers, for example. Many were crowned at an age when most of us would struggle to tie our shoes. They had to perform public rituals, manage advisors, and maintain political alliances. Mistakes were visible, and yet they carried on, often growing into rulers who balanced ritual precision with political savvy. And if a child ruler failed, that was quietly catastrophic for everyone involved, not just the young monarch. Elites also carried subtle emotional burdens. Marriage was rarely about affection, it was about alliance and continuity. Fertility pressures, public expectations, and ritual obligations compounded daily stress. For queens and consorts, the combination of isolation, ceremonial performance, and political scrutiny could create quiet despair. Even in palaces filled with luxury, they lived under rules that left little room for personal desire. Now, let's drift to the ordinary citizens, whose lives were slower but still tightly structured. Farmers, artisans, and merchants participated in the same seasonal rhythms and rituals that governed elite lives, though with slightly less ceremonial oversight. Their daily concerns, food, family, work, were constant. Yet, in this repetition, there was a subtle rhythm, a meditation of survival that lent a quiet dignity to their lives. Cooking maize, tending fields, weaving textiles, or attending a festival created patterns, a soft continuity that anchored them in the world. We should also consider the interplay between tragedy and creativity, the pressures of life, drought, disease. Political tension didn't stop the Maya from producing extraordinary art, architecture, and astronomy. Pain and labor were inseparable from creativity. Temple reliefs depict rulers performing rituals, ballgame scenes, and daily activities. Glyphs record births, deaths, and dynastic shifts with astonishing precision. Even hardship was transformed into beauty, leaving a legacy that still captivates us today. And speaking of legacy, that's perhaps the most calming thought as we near the end. The Maya civilization, despite environmental pressures, warfare, and societal stress, endured through knowledge, adaptation, and human persistence. Their calendars, glyphs, and monumental architecture speak to a society deeply attentive to time, to ritual, and to human continuity. Even when cities declined, communities persisted, and cultural memory carried forward into subsequent generations. The Maya remind us that human effort, patience, and quiet resilience can leave traces far beyond the immediate pressures of life. Finally, let's drift to the nighttime perspective. Picture a Maya city as the sun sets, families resting in huts, nobles lying quietly in palaces, the soft rustle of leaves, distant animal calls, and the occasional ceremonial drum echoing faintly in the jungle. Everyone is breathing, working, observing, worrying, celebrating, or mourning, but always part of a subtle, living rhythm. And in that rhythm, there is a gentle continuity. Life is messy, often stressful, sometimes tragic, but it flows. Like the soft current of a river through dense jungle, patient and enduring.